We emerged from the passageway into a wide circular clearing about 200 feet in diameter, surrounded by the sheltering wall of holly. At the centre stood a single ancient oak tree, its canopy spreading over our heads, forming an intricate branching dome. Guests were directed to form 2 semicircles around the oak. As I shuffled along with my group, I could see the 3 other passages into the clearing, running west, east, and north. At the northern entrance, a unicorn, a brilliant white creature, so white she was almost luminous, with a long glistening mane neatly combed down one side of her neck, and wearing a flowing robe over her back which hung down her flanks and rump. The fabric shimmered in pale hues of silver and iridescent green. She was crowned with a snug-fitting wreath of ivy wound around the top of her head, with space to allow her long ears to stick up through the foliage. The iridescent silvery horn jutted 3 feet into the air, just below the base of the wreath. Her slender bipedal companions wore the customary white robes and evergreen foliage atop their heads. She and her entourage probably appeared just as our carriages came into view. There be a large pentagram, whitewashed on the far side of the hill somewhere, beaming and fringed with frozen grass. No bad roads and backaches for these fortunate travellers. Oh, dear me, no, the very thought. Blessed as they are, with an enviable ability to journey free of the confines of physical distance and the passage of time. Magic of such magnitude that mere mortals can only stand wide-eyed with a sense of awe. Theoretically, with all the forbidden knowledge I have securely locked away in my library, I too could have travelled here in style. But unfortunately, unlike unicorns, I am not an all-powerful, multi-dimensional being. Rather unfairly, all of me is confined to only one location at any one time. Not to mention, it would probably be the last thing I ever tried to do. Although they are mortal beings, like every living creature, their unusual physical complexity enables them to exist in both the earthly and the spirit realm in the same instant. Everyone knows what a unicorn looks like here, a pretty pony with a nasty-looking spike in the middle of its head. However, it will appear in a quite different form elsewhere, rather like a face at a window looking in from the dark. We inside can see the face, but just because we can't see the attached body beyond is no reason to assume it doesn't exist. Or a bit like dipping your finger into a mill pond. All a fish sees is a sudden appearance of a big, fat worm. Quite what the less familiar part of a unicorn looks like is anyone's guess. I've 1 or 2 ancient volumes at home that contain an engraver's interpretation of a traveller's account of their conversation with some mysterious, wizened practitioner of black magic who claimed to have seen one during a brief and perilous expedition into one of the many timeless voids floating around out there. Generally, they're depicted as a vast coiled serpent-like dragon with anywhere from 50 to 1,000 flailing horns along its body, sometimes breathing brimstone and fire, but that's optional apparently, and probably very dependent on how much the engraver was being paid. I suspect it doesn't come close to describing what they really look like. After all, unicorns can come and go as they please in the other dimensions, without fear of interference from other, less benign inhabitants of the void. I mean, the kind of monsters that could devour the type of demon that would happily turn a trespassing werewolf sorcerer into a matching fur hat, scarf, and gloves ensemble. I'm even doubtful that what we get to see in this world isn't just a convenient disguise agreed upon eons ago. What should we look like in the mortal realm? Any ideas? How about a white horse? Good. Large enough not to be stepped on, small enough to fit through most doors if necessary, and not so alarming that we might stampede farm animals. But what about flailing body horns? I like my 1,000 horns. They're my best feature. Oh, all right. We'll have 1 static horn, but on the head at the front so we don't skewer anyone by accident. Everyone in favor, raise a wing. So, dear reader, you can now consider yourself a bit of an expert in the physiology of unicorns. I spotted Lycurgus trotting over toward the unicorn, followed by one of his servants, carrying a fabric-covered box, who handed it to an attendant, as his master talked and nodded to members of the group, and then bowing to the priestess, he and the servant respectfully backed away, then hurried over and disappeared through the west entrance. A minute later, he could be seen running out toward the easterly one, disappearing again. He emerged a few minutes later, signaled, and finally joined the front of the bride's guests. Even from this distance I could tell he was panting heavily. However, I failed to see Seraphina at his side. Presumably she had sacrificed her mourning on the altar of domestic vigilance, keeping the sharp eye of a suspicious eagle upon the feast preparations at the house. The success of the day, I'm sure, was of the utmost importance to her brother's future prosperity. His immediate family would, by tomorrow evening, have every excuse to collapse into chairs, clutching champagne glasses, exhausted but relieved. Even now I could imagine Seraphina, the very picture of stoic martyrdom, presiding over a small army of perspiring cooks who clanged their pots like badly tuned bells and basted their spit roasts with the grim concentration of surgeons. Servants flying in all directions, carrying chairs, tablecloths, and flowers, while she barked instructions with the force of a general, whilst writing place settings with one hand and inspecting the scandalous cleanliness of the tableware with the other. The low murmur of the crowd died down as a troop of sirens emerged from the north gateway and fanned out around the edge of the clearing. One could best describe a siren as a brightly colored avian-like creature with a large feathered chest and a smooth face, not unlike an elf's. They are about 4 feet tall, have thin bird-like legs with sizable feet and talons. Although sirens can fly, they tend not to, as they have an impressive stride for someone of that height, and any long-distance travel for prized performers like these is usually prearranged via an escorted party pentagram. Once the last settled into place, 2 attendants on either side of the priestess, now standing directly in front of the oak's wide trunk, stepped forward a few paces, turned to the great tree, and raised their arms high in the air. At that moment the whole grove vibrated with a soft humming sound that resonated all through my body. The siren choir had just opened their mouths. This continued for 2 or 3 minutes, steadily changing its modulation, pitch, and strength. My whole being relaxed. The front of my head felt warm and fuzzy, and all my accumulated worries and regrets evaporated like mist. The sound died away, and everyone stood in a blissful silence. Then a more musical melody started up, and the 2 attendants turned. One walked toward the east, the other to the west. They both disappeared through an entrance, and moments later emerged again, leading the bride with her father at her side, the groom with his mother at his. All walked to the center. The bride wore a white dress with a veil over her face, which hung down over her nose. On her head was a wreath of white flowers. The groom wore a black dress suit, with tails hanging either side of his own immaculately brushed tail, his head crowned with a wreath of ivy and oak leaves. The dear thing did look so smart. The small group stood before the unicorn for a brief moment. Then the parents bowed and curtsied, and were guided to their places next to their spouse. The attendants then returned to join their compatriots in a semicircle in front of the choir behind. The singing died away, leaving just the sound of rustling leaves and quietly creaking branches above them. The betrothed stood side by side in front of the priestess, who started to recite the familiar marriage ceremony monologue used at weddings of most inhabitants of Fantasia, at least those living this side of the great dividing mountains. Naturally, there were a few minor alterations and additions in the text for a werewolf ceremony. The usual archaic stuff about sharing carcasses from the hunt, not devouring one's offspring, and a lot of stuff about obeying the other in specific circumstances. Her voice was curiously soft and reedy for a creature with such a large head and throat. Delicate as the sound was, there was the uncanny experience of the words coming from inside your skull and not through your ears. The ceremony continued with the customary exchanging of vows. Then came the symbolic coupling. One of the attendants opened the mysterious box borne earlier by Lycurgus, and from within produced 2 silver collars and 2 long ribbons, one black, one white. The priestess, who was muttering sacred phrases, nodded. The attendants advanced, fastening a collar securely around each tender neck of the betrothed. Then, with theatrical reverence, they fastened long ribbons to the clasps, white tied to the brides, black to the grooms. The dangling ends were ceremoniously placed into the left hands of bride and groom. Each now grasped the leash of the other. The symbolism was not subtle. Every werewolf knows this quaint custom is a relic of those charmingly barbaric days when the collars were iron and a chain between them was locked, and the whole post-nuptial arrangement endured for 2 lunar cycles. The object, of course, was to ensure the appropriate litter and reassure the 2 families who the father actually was. Nowadays, the harnesses are merely decorative, and the happy couple are expected to wear them only for the duration of the festivities, continually clutching their partner's ribbon with desperate devotion. This inevitably results in delightfully comic tangles with well-wishers, as everyone is dragged together in a knot of matrimonial affection. It's all terribly heartwarming, provided one is watching from a safe distance and not actually involved. An image that perfectly represents married life, though no one dares say so aloud. Before I continue, I'd like to address what I believe to be a common misconception. That whole werewolves and the aversion to silver nonsense. I've heard of this superstition, no doubt held by primitive folk in far-off lands who never travelled beyond their own gatepost. Like those who cover up mirrors during thunderstorms, or the idiots who believe dragons sleep upon piles of hoarded gold. Listen, dear, the only piles you'll find in dragon caves are of foul-smelling dung that can corrode your flesh if you're ever unwise enough to pick it up. I mean, silver, of all things. I ask you, what are we supposed to use for cutlery? Rustic wooden spoons? But I digress. The priestess concluded her monologue with those immortal lines, "I pronounce you husband and wife. You may lick the bride." As the couple embraced, their immediate families all joined in a loud howl. An act that displayed approval of the union, and as a symbolic declaration of a new and unbreakable kinship between the 2 households. The happy couple turned, and walking side by side, ribbons in hand, disappeared out of the grove. To the accompaniment of echoing howls, then the choir started a low melodic tune, and at this signal the howling quietened, and the guests, led by the family members following the newlyweds, began to slowly file out in silence. By the time we were all out of the grove, the marriage coach had been readied to be the first one to journey back to the house, closely followed by those that were to transport family. After the customary fussing, all were filled with the correct travellers, and the small procession started off down the hill. The wedding carriage, trailing a ragged train of bones and antlers at the end of ropes that clattered and bounced along the ground as they went. It did not escape my notice that amongst the procession was a large cart full of smiling mercenary goblins, dutifully waving their flags and decorated halberds in the air. partially in a well-rehearsed, spontaneous display of joyful celebration, but presumably mostly in a not-so-subtle display to anyone they encountered during the journey that the party was tooled up, a phrase used, I believe, in the less salubrious parts of any town. One by one, everybody was allocated a vehicle, eventually setting off back down the slope at a sedate pace in eager anticipation of whatever grand reception awaited us. Upon our triumphal return, we were received by ushers wearing smiles of professional optimism, who ushered us, quite literally, into the grand hall. This noble space had undergone a remarkable metamorphosis, emerging as a banqueting hall of great ambition. 3 stately rows of long tables marched forward with military precision, culminating in the exalted top table at the far end. Tableware gleamed, cutlery lounged expectantly beside glasses, candelabras stood tall in flickering splendor, and floral arrangements bloomed as though keenly aware of the attention they were receiving. At length everyone discovered their appointed seat, some with delight, others with resignation. At the center of the top table sat the newlyweds, radiant and victorious, flanked on either side by smiling family members whose expressions suggested equal measures of joy, pride, and quiet relief. Once we were all safely installed in our allotted places, and the discordant symphony of scraping chair legs had at last faded into merciful silence, a glass was delicately assaulted with a fork by Lycurgus, an act which instantly summoned the attention of the room to the top table. The speeches, that most ceremonial of endurance tests, could now begin. Tradition, that tireless guardian of weddings, decreed that the father of the groom should lead, followed by the brides. The groom's father rose to the occasion by delivering a speech of considerable length and admirable self-approval, in which his achievements, both parental and personal, were reviewed with a generosity usually reserved for autobiographies. The bride's father, by contrast, offered a far more merciful contribution, adhering closely to the well-worn and comforting script of such occasions, the pairing off of daughters, the acquisition of sons, the noble merging of families, and the mutual sharing of destinies. All the familiar themes and platitudes appeared on cue, much to everyone's quiet relief. Throughout these orations, waiters glided discreetly among the tables, replenishing glasses in preparation for the toast to the couple and their promising future. When the second speech concluded, Lycurgus rose once more, and at his signal we were treated to a renewed cacophony of chair legs protesting their sudden displacement. We stood, raised our glasses, and with great solemnity, and no small amount of enthusiasm, we saluted and blessed the union. A select handful of the couple's friends and associates felt compelled to embellish the blessing with cheeky howls and an enthusiastic display of tongue-lolling and panting, which caused the bride and groom to look sheepishly embarrassed, as it was intended in the time-honored tradition. We reseated ourselves, and the gentle murmur of polite conversation with one's immediate neighbours resumed. I found myself wedged between 2 elderly wolves, one male, one female, who proved, upon investigation, to be related by marriage to our hosts. This happy discovery granted us an immediate and entirely unwarranted sense of intimacy, enabling us to discuss at length everything we held in common, most notably our considered opinions of Lycurgus's property. We spoke with the air of experts, buoyed by the comforting illusion that our tenuous blood ties endowed us with both insight and authority. At this point, the familiar battalion of waiters advanced bearing the soup course. Conversation faltered as each guest in turn paused to regard the steaming dish placed before them with solemn concentration, as though seeking in its depths not merely sustenance but spiritual meaning. One then undertook the grave task of selecting the correct piece of cutlery from the intimidating abundance provided, a decision demanding both courage and social awareness. No sooner had the soup been dispatched than the much-anticipated main course made its triumphant appearance. It arrived as a mound of roasted meats, obtained from a wide selection of luckless four-legged creatures, and adorned with sprigs of sweet-smelling herbs and root vegetables carved with great skill into the shapes of flowers, purely decorative, one sensed, and certainly not intended to be put in one's mouth. It was evident to both eye and nose that alternative offerings had been thoughtfully provided, plates of fish and fowl for guests of feline and mustelid heritage, whose refined palates and daintier jaws demanded more delicate indulgences. Meanwhile, those few guests who subsisted exclusively on roots, leaves, and any other part of a plant they could digest were all seated together at the far end of one table, no doubt positioned at a strategic distance from the pervasive aromas of roasted meat. They appeared well supplied with vegetables and nuts to grind dutifully between those blunt teeth of theirs in a display of dietary conviction that inspired equal measures of admiration and pity. Then the cake was brought forth by smiling waiters and set down in front of the happy couple. Wolf wedding cake towers were usually constructed of 2 or 3 cylinders made of solid potted meat jelly, covered in a glistening layer of white beef fat, with small decorative pastry flowers stuck to it, and of course sporting the traditional pastry figures representing the bride and groom side by side atop the whole carnal edifice. The cake was indeed a beautiful picture of greasy indulgence. Another tinkling of a glass, and it was Maximilian's turn to stand and say a few words of thanks to the innumerable folk involved in the arrangement of the big day, and presumably, by extension, the arrangement of the entire pairing, and his and Beatrice, his new wife's, future life together. All spoken with a convincingly believable expression of relieved delight spread across his face, while Beatrice played her part with impeccable professionalism, grasping the black ribbon in both hands and staring up at her new husband as he spoke, smiling proudly and beaming radiantly every time he turned to her during his oratory, with just a hint of charmingly bashful eye flutters sprinkled throughout the performance. I smiled and wiped away a stray tear from my eye. It seemed that, at the very least, they could work well together as a convincing double act in public, a skill they would have to use constantly from now on. All the time, doting family members smiled and nodded at his every well-chosen word. I shot a glance at the groom's father, sitting looking like the cat that got the whole dairy, not just the bowl. I felt rather sorry for Beatrice, having him as a new father-in-law, but she could at least console herself by spending large quantities of his money, building and feathering a cosy nest for any future arrivals. Maximilian's speech prompted polite applause and a few howls, and another enthusiastic toast to their future. Then Beatrice stood, and together, clutching the handle of an overly large ceremonial knife, they made the first symbolic stab into the fleshy centre of the wedding cake.